Today is December 9th, 2009. We are at the Glenview Public Library. My name is Laura Moderhock, and we are interviewing Mr. Walter Reed. Can you tell us what day you were born and year?
Yes, I can. I was born on February 27, 1924.
Can you tell us what war and branch of service you were part of?
Sure, I was in World War II, and I actually didn't end up in the service that I started out in. I started when I was drafted in 1943. I was put into the Army Corps of Engineers, and that was because of my prior occupation. But after we landed in Normandy and I was in a replacement battalion in France, in central France, the Army decided it needed more German speakers to interrogate prisoners. And I was transferred to the Military Intelligence Service as a prisoner interrogator. And from that time on, I served with the 95th Infantry Division in France and in Germany.
What was the highest rank you achieved by the end of your service?
Well, as you can tell from the stripes, I was a staff sergeant.
Can you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Würzburg, Germany, which is in northern Bavaria.
How is it that you came to the United States then?
I came to the United States because the Nazi Germans didn't like Jewish people. And I was a Jewish kid, and like all the other Jewish people in Germany, Austria, and occupied countries, I was not liked by the Nazis. In fact, they arrested me on the so-called Kristallnacht when I was 14 years old, along with my dad, imprisoned me for 3 days, and in many other ways, I was got the same treatment that all the other Jewish people and the people the Nazis didn't like received. So my parents had the foresight to send me to Belgium in 1939 as a 15-year-old. I was in a children's colony there. The colony was once again subject to German persecution when the Germans invaded Belgium, France and Holland, Luxembourg in 1940. And about 100 of us, children, teenagers, fled to southern France along with 1 million other people. And I was there as a refugee and didn't come to the United States until 90 days before Pearl Harbor. So that's the very brief history of how I got here and why I was capable of being drafted into the U.S. Army.
Can you tell us a little bit what those 3 days were like for you when you were imprisoned in Germany or in Austria or wherever?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Let's say it louder.
You said you were imprisoned for 3 days, you and your father.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit what that was like?
Well, I can tell you this, that the Nazis began to badmouth and in some ways disadvantage Jewish people all over Germany as soon as they came into power in 1933, and they promised that they would do that even before they came into power. So things got gradually worse, and it was somewhat of a surprise that honorable German citizens, as we were, would be subject to mass arrest. You probably know or heard about Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, which is only a reference to the fact that they shattered many store windows of Jewish owners all over Germany. And that day, really during 2 days in November 1938, they arrested some 30,000 Jewish men. Not many boys, but in my community, in my village where I lived, 2 boys were arrested. I was one of them, by mistake, and they sent me home 3 days later. The 3 days in jail, and the very fact of being hauled out of our house early in the morning without any reason, without any warning, is, in my memory, the kind of a thing where you really don't know what to expect. I recall vividly that we didn't know whether they're going to beat us up, whether they're going to shoot us, what they're going to do. I don't think they knew either, because this was done all over Germany at the instigation of the higher-ups, and the low-down people, the brown-shirted SAs, they were called, in our village, probably didn't know any more than anybody else as to why they were doing this, except they hated Jews, and they got the orders from higher up that this is what's going to happen. So it felt like, well, imagine if somebody arrested you tomorrow morning and hauled you out of your house, how would you feel? And if you had not done anything wrong or had not committed any crime, except maybe because you're Catholic in America, all of a sudden the rest are all Catholics. That's how it was.
You were drafted into the war, correct?
Yes, I was.
Were you like happy to be drafted, but did you want to be a part of the conflict, or were you not so excited about
It's
it?
very interesting to address that question today, 60, 70 years later, because the context in which we're talking about it is totally different from what it was like in 1943. In 1943, when I was drafted, America had already been attacked by the Japanese, as you know, 70-some years ago this week. And the general attitude of Americans was, we've got to defend ourselves. Most people don't realize this today. I was living in Brooklyn, New York. I was 19 years old, 17 when the war broke out. And at that time, there was grave danger in the minds of people that the Germans would land U-boats on Long Island. It sounds preposterous today, but that was the feeling. And there were air raid wardens because we were afraid the Germans would bomb us. They would have had a dickens of a time flying across to the United States from Germany in their planes at that time and bombing us. But that was the paranoia and the idea in this country, a lot worse than 9/11, much worse. You can't even imagine it. So what does that have to do with my being drafted? There were an awful lot of young people who volunteered because they were patriotic, as has happened in other wars. There were an awful lot of other people who, A, did not really want to be soldiers, and B, who had other things on their agenda. In my case, education. As a refugee from Nazi Germany, I had already lost 3 years of schooling while I was a refugee. And I was working during the day in New York City and going to school at night, to high school at night. And I desperately wanted to finish high school because I was already 18, 19 years old and I should have been out of high school, but I wasn't. So I did not want to go into the service for that reason. I really wasn't unpatriotic. I didn't say to myself, oh, I'm scared. We all were. But it was more that my aim at the time was to finish high school. And frankly, I was deferred twice because I was an apprentice tool and die maker in New York. They needed those for the war effort. And while I wasn't doing war work, that deferred me twice. And eventually, things got so tight, the Army needed people, that my draft board would no longer defer me, and I was drafted before I could finish high school. And the interesting part for you high school students may be that the State Board of Regents in New York, which controls education in New York, gave me a high school diploma 3 months after I was drafted, even though I didn't finish. That's a long story about how I felt about being drafted, but there were reasons. It's not like, we always think of it cut and dried, so-and-so didn't want to serve and so-and-so serves. Often the reasons were quite convoluted, and many volunteered.
Where exactly did you go once you were drafted?
I was, of course, living in Brooklyn, New York, so the induction centers usually were nearby. I was sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and after the initial issuing of uniforms and making records, etc., I was immediately shipped to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. In those days, among those who served there, it was known the hellhole of the world because it was beastly hot, it was filthy, it had no facilities, and the drill sergeants saw to it that these young guys who were civilians and didn't know anything about military needed to become hard-nosed soldiers. So they mistreated us. It's a little bit like Marine Corps initiation and so forth. It was not a nice place. We didn't enjoy it, and we were never allowed to leave the post. This was wartime, and things were totally different from now. Now we sort of catered to soldiers. In those days, soldiers needed to be made by staff sergeants, and things were pretty nasty, primitive, not very nice. And no one liked Fort Leonard Wood. I wasn't the only one. We commiserated with each other. And soldiers have a great capability of, when they're suffering from what's happening to them, then they do something in vernacular always used to be called bitching. and we did a lot of pitching.
After your boot camp experience, then, where did you travel to?
Well, the Army was renowned in my day, in the 1940s during the war, that if you were drafted and you were a cook, you would not be a cook in the Army, you became a truck driver. And if you were a truck driver, you were sure to become a cook. And that was the common wisdom and the stuff we joked about all the time. In my case, it was different. I was an apprentice tool and die maker, and my MOS, my designation, was they trained me as a bulldozer mechanic. So it was as close as you can get. And they sent me to bulldozer mechanic school at an ordnance camp outside Baltimore for 3 months and trained me to repair bulldozers for the Corps of Engineers. And from there they sent me to near Granite City, Illinois, and to another ordnance camp where I got further training. And by the time I was shipped over to England in March of 1944, I was still a bulldozer mechanic. And once we got to England, the Army realized that they had enough bulldozer mechanics. What they really needed was combat engineers. And combat engineers, we immediately knew, and I'd like to tell you what that means. That's like the Seabees in the Navy. Combat engineers, the first thing you learn is how to fight fixed bayonets and do hand-to-hand combat, it was known. And we were on the heaths in England faking bayoneting each other. That was scary. Nobody liked it. We were all just worried stiff. Who's going to get it first, the Germans or we? And then we had all kinds of other training, such as building pontoon bridges, and how to handle explosives, and how to tie knots, and all kinds of things. Combat engineers' job is to go in ahead of the infantry. And from that moment on, my existence in the Army as a combat engineer was very scary, constantly worried as to how are we going to survive doing this. That was the attitude of me and all my buddies who were in the same kind of thing. Fortunately for me, however, I was being trained in what was called a replacement battalion. And they still have that kind of thing today, but not quite the same way. The replacement battalion were cannon fodder. Replacement battalion guys were people who were held in reserve, and as soon as there were casualties at the front, they picked us up and put us in place of the people who were wounded or killed, which had very bad connotations for us. Because number one, the guys who survived in those units, say Company A, and this guy Walter Reed comes in, he didn't train with us, we don't know who he is, we don't know what kind of a guy he is, you immediately were downgraded. And you were not part of it. Also, you felt badly because you didn't know anybody. So that was the worst of all places. Combat engineer replacement battalion was not very good. And that's how I landed in Normandy a week after the invasion, as a combat engineer. The battle had moved inland by about 10 kilometers. You could still hear the artillery loudly. And the debris was all still on the beaches. And I almost drowned climbing over the ship because we were carrying a heavy duffel bag, a rifle, a gas mask, steel helmet, ammunition, and who knows what else. And I almost just went under as I landed because there were no landing facilities. You just landed out into the water and then hiked ashore. But as you can see, I made it.
What was your job on D-Day? What were you destined to do on the beach?
On D-Day, I was in southern England in some swampy, wooded area in a pup tent with some other GIs who had been brought from central England to southern England. We did not know. The one thing that most people don't realize today, it's quite similar today with different equipment. But in those days, we didn't even have the equipment to communicate. So typical GIs, unless they were in division headquarters or with General Eisenhower, the typical soldier in World War II, where I was, never knew what was going on and never had any idea who was doing what. So that when we were taken to southern England a few weeks before the invasion, and were there on D-Day, we had no idea there was a D-Day. In fact, it didn't have a name yet. And today we talk glibly about those things. We just didn't know anything. And we certainly didn't find out that we had landed in Normandy until a couple of days later, maybe, and then very sketchy information. And the next thing we knew, about 4 or 5 days, 6 days after that invasion, we were taken to the port and loaded on landing ships and bunched in there. And all of a sudden we were on the English Channel, and then we landed in France. Where we were going, what was happening, whether the Germans were throwing everybody back into the English Channel, or whether we were conquering all of Germany at that point, nobody knew. The one thing that prevailed in those days, always, and the one thing that I remember most vividly is, nobody ever knew anything. And it was impossible to communicate. One of the things people today don't understand, in the days when we landed in Normandy, if Company A wanted to communicate with Company B in the same regiment, the same battalion, they first had to lay wire, telephone wire, because there were no walkie-talkies, no wireless, so that you either waited for the signal corps to come and lay wire so you could use your phone and communicate with them, or you send a messenger by jeep or on foot. That's the only way you could communicate. So you can imagine an ordinary private like me, I was still a private, trying to figure out where we were, what we were doing, impossible. And all my buddies that I was with were just like me. So when you think about the military today and all the sophisticated stuff they do, and they get on cable television and they show you what they've got and they kick indoors, that's all very fancy stuff. But that's not the way war is, and that's not the way our war was.
Can you tell us about some of your other combat experiences? Do any of them stick out to you?
Well, my most memorable combat experience were two things in Normandy. The first night, as I just said, we were all greenhorns. We didn't know what was going on, where we were, where the Germans were. We were out among the hedgerows in the fields of Normandy. And the first night was like the 4th of July. The sky was lit up all night long, and there was the noise of exploding, not 4th of July fireworks, but real shells and bombs in the distance, 8-10 kilometers away from us. And it was scary, because we didn't know whether it was ours or theirs, or whether they were advancing or we were. So the first night was scary. Then we got used to it a little bit. And then in July, about 4 weeks, 5 weeks after we landed, we camped in the fields in Normandy and advanced, moved here and there, but not very far. And the Germans had the Americans and the British stalled in Normandy until a certain road was crossed, which they held, and we couldn't dislodge them. On one morning in early July, the sky suddenly was filled with the noise of airplanes. At first we didn't know whose airplanes, but then we realized they were coming from the north, so they had to be ours. And that morning, for about 2 or 3 hours, 1,000 airplanes flew. If you can imagine an air show with 1,000 airplanes, that doesn't happen here, even in the big air show in Chicago. But these were one after the other, approximately, I didn't count them, but I'm told it was about 1,000 planes came over from England to bomb one place, St. Lô. St. Lô was this road hub that the Germans were holding and that kept the Allies, the Americans, from advancing. That morning, St. Lô was destroyed, bombed into smithereens. There was nothing left standing. The Germans who were there were either killed or fled. And that's when General Patton started his advance with his tanks. And I was on the ground that morning, about 10 miles north of St. Lô on our side. And the ground shook like in an earthquake. And it didn't shake just once. It shook for 2 or 3 hours. And that was one of the really memorable experiences. Another was after I was retrained and transferred to military intelligence. This was in August of 1944, after Paris had fallen, was liberated. We were assigned to the 95th Infantry Division, a team of prisoner interrogators. There were 7 of us. And we came out to meet the 95th Infantry Division, which had just arrived from the USA. and was in battle by that time already east and southeast of Paris, near the city of Metz. We joined them after they got there. We were moved from Paris in jeeps out to the division headquarters. And we came through the city of Metz in Lorraine, in southeastern France, during the night. Metz had just fallen, and the whole city was smoking. We complain and are so upset about 9/11, rightly so, but 9/11 was peanuts compared to what Metz looked like that night. And that was my first real view of a destroyed city. I've seen many after that, in Germany especially, but Metz was my first experience of a city all in shambles and smoking, French city. But we had to do that in order to push the Germans back and conquer it. That was another experience that I had. Another experience I had that's worth mentioning was in December 1944, just about right soon after, well, in 2 weeks from now. We were then interrogating German prisoners at the front. My job of interrogating prisoners was not back in some prison camp. We were assigned to interrogate newly taken prisoners at the front. So I was right near the front lines with this infantry division. And our job was to find out what was going on the other side of the German line. And these guys, some bedraggled, all of them scared. The daylights were scared out of them, because if you're just taken prisoner by the enemy, you don't know what to expect. And you're really scared, you're worried. Well, these are the people we were interrogating. And normally, I should add, as a veteran, whose job for most of the action in the war was to interrogate enemy prisoners, I am appalled at what our country has done with the interrogation of prisoners, sanctioned and ordered by the highest military of this country and allowed by the president. I was appalled when I first heard about Abu Ghraib, and I wasn't appalled as an American. I was appalled as a guy who did this during World War II. And the reason I was appalled is that in our operations in World War II, if anyone had ever dared do what our people did to the prisoners in Iraq, we would have been punished severely. And we were told that, and we knew that. And our officers were watching carefully that no GI interrogator ever violated the rules, and we knew all about the Geneva Conventions. We were taught not to violate them. So my experience with prisoners was totally different from what the American people have learned about what our country has done to violate international conventions during that war. And as you can tell from the way I'm talking, I'm quite passionate about it. The reason I'm telling you that story or telling you that background is we were human beings. And at Christmas time in 1944, when the war was not yet over, it was just before the Battle of the Bulge, we had prisoners in the basement of a house we were occupying, in which we were interrogating them. And on Christmas Eve, we had sort of, I don't know where we got it, but we had a little Christmas tree. I don't know where we got it or where we found decorations. Probably stuck some candles on it, I don't remember. But somebody had the idea, why don't we get those Germans up out of the cellar and wish them a Merry Christmas? So we got those 8 or 10 prisoners we had in the cellar that we were interrogating that day, and the next day we had them come upstairs, and they didn't know what to expect. There were candles on the Christmas tree. And since we were all German speakers, to interrogate German prisoners, you had to be a German speaker. We were all German speakers, so we sang Christmas songs in German with the German prisoners. And after the songs and after some cookies or whatever we had, we stuck them back downstairs and locked them up.
I look at that.
Were you, did you enjoy being able to use your German background to the American advantage?
I cannot say that I enjoyed using my German background. War is not like that. Our emotions in battle, in war, were different from what people normally think. I'm often asked this question as to, well, how was it that you got back at the Germans? frankly, our attitude was pretty uniform, and it was like this. And if you pardon my using strong language, that's how we talked. These bastards are killing our buddies, and we've got to get them. And whether I knew German or not, or whether I could find out in German or converse with them or not, was not all that important to anybody, including me. What was important is if we could find out where their ammunition dump was, whether I spoke German or not, or how many trucks they had, and how many casualties they had, etc., in their unit, which was very important to our officers to find out in directing the, not Eisenhower, not grandiose schemes, but right down here where our company, our battalion was. This is the kind of thing we did. So frankly, the fact that I could speak with them, well, yeah, I could do this better than the guys from Kentucky or Missouri because they didn't speak German. Yes, but it wasn't any great big deal. They had jobs to do and they did them. We had jobs to do and we did them. And this is how we felt about it. It's a good question, but it really isn't anything that, you know, we weren't singled out and said, oh, hey, Reed, you're a great guy, we need you. No.
Did you try to stay in touch with anyone back in America while you were overseas?
We all stayed in touch with America, but not the way it's done today. You know, today, most GIs, most troops, American troops in battle places can get on their cell phones or can get on their computers and communicate with America. We had something, it was called APO, Army Post Office, and it was not instant communication. As a matter of fact, you had a number, American Post Office number, and that showed where the American military postal service could get a letter to you. And sometimes it took 4 weeks, sometimes it took 8 weeks, 6 weeks, and this is how we communicated back and forth. Now, you have to understand that most of the time we weren't sitting around writing letters, we had other things to do. But when there was time to do that, we would write home. We certainly did not telephone. We were not on television because, you know, television had not yet been invented. Or if it was invented, it wasn't in use yet. So the communication was very sparse, very occasional, and it was always a great event when a letter from home arrived, if it reached us. You know, we were always on the move. I'm talking about during the war. When the war was over, it was easier. But while we were moving, it was pretty difficult for the mail to catch up. So it was not a daily event. It was kind of very, very sketchy.
What was the food like while you were overseas?
That's the thing we really need to talk about. If you were somewhere in a rear base, like say we were in England waiting, you know, for things to happen for several months, you had the typical army chow, it was called. It wasn't called food, it was chow. That was the word. And it was cooked by former truck drivers. So, I'm making this up, they weren't all truck drivers. But it was not professional cooks. And if they were trained as army cooks, they still were they were not like what your mom makes. So, food was pretty terrible. While we were in the war zone, in the battle zone, and moving along, there were two kinds of food, C rations and K rations. C rations were the more elaborate kinds of things. They were all manufactured somewhere in Nebraska or wherever. And, you know, prepared foods, you didn't heat them, you ate them cold most of the time. There was no place to heat anything, and if you had a fire, God help you, the Germans might see the smoke. So, and you didn't have any kitchen facilities or anything out in the field. I mean, you did have field kitchens where we were stationary and where we were. While I was in the replacement battalion, it was different. So the food was terrible, and not enough of it, and we all complained about it all the time, and it was not very good. Now, I have an interesting story to tell you, however, and if my wife were here, she would insist I tell it to you. Before I was transferred to the Military Intelligence Service, and while I was still in the replacement battalion as a combat engineer, we were for a while in a small village, just stationed there, waiting there, and constantly guys were pulled out from our replacement battalion to the front. And we were in this little village about 50 miles south of Paris. And in that little village, we must have stayed about 4 or 5 weeks, as I recall. And I was the only guy in the whole battalion that spoke French. Since I had lived in France as a refugee and had taken French lessons in school in Germany, I could speak French fluently, and I still do. And so I became the interpreter for the battalion commander. And one night I was walking through the village streets. We weren't doing anything, we were just waiting. And a little old lady stood on a doorstep, gray hair, black clothing like many of those old French women wore. Now they're all rejuvenated, but that was the uniform. And she said, "Bonsoir, monsieur." And I said, "Bonsoir, madame." And she just about fell off the stoop because he was an American GI, one of the very few whom she could speak with. And so we got acquainted, and it turned out her son was the village butcher. In those days, the French people had virtually nothing to eat. Food was rationed, particularly under the German occupation, for years. And we had food, but it wasn't edible. But the French village butcher was butchering pigs and other things, and he had meat, even though it was rationed. And his wife was a superb cook. And so when the grandmother found out that I spoke French, I was invited to the butcher's house for dinner. And we were on this base right in the village, so I could leave, I could go there. And I had some fantastic food for about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. I brought candy bars and cigarettes, and they served marvelously cooked French food, and I was in seventh heaven. And I was the envy of all my buddies. And the few chosen ones, including a few officers, were invited to come with me to the butcher's house. Now, the only reason that's worth telling, you asked me about food, that's the only time I got decent food. But the real story is, we became so enamored of each other that to this very day, some 65, 70 years later, these French people and their children and grandchildren are like family to my family. And they have been here. I live in Wilmette. They visited in Wilmette. We visited them in France in June this year for the umpteenth time. And just because I had cigarettes and candy and they had good food, and because we liked each other, and because I spoke French, we are real family friendly to this very day.
Oh.
So I had an interesting food experience.
While you were in the service, did you have any experiences with anti-Semitism?
I cannot recall any specific experience, but I have to say that in 1941, long before the Civil Rights Movement, America was very racist. America was full of demeaning other people. And in the Army, I'm only speaking of the Army now, the common language was, "You goddamn Dago," which were the Italians, "You goddamn and worse Polak," which were the Polish people, and "You goddamn Kike," which were the Jewish people. And it was not done with hatred. It was the common way that Americans felt and dealt with each other in those days. And of course, among military folks, it's always more pronounced and more earthy than it is among the general population. So was there anti-Semitism? That's the kind there was. And there was anti-Semitism rampant in America in those days. And I, having come out of a persecuted situation from Nazi Germany, was probably a lot more sensitive to that and recognized it much further away than ordinary people. So I'm very much aware that the nice home I live in East Wilmette right now, I could not have bought, even if I had had the money, in 1943, because realtors discriminated. And there were many country clubs that would not have accepted me. And there were colleges that would not have let me go to law school, except under an anti-Semitic quota. So if you understand that America, before the Civil Rights Movement, was not a very democratic and nice country from the point of view that we and you look at today, I was very much aware of anti-Semitism. However, in the military, if you carried that too far, sooner or later other people who were, after all, in the same war with you, and were going to be fighting with you against an enemy, would sooner or later react, even ordinary soldiers, let alone the officers, and say, cut that out. But if the soldier, and I don't want to pick on Kentucky or Tennessee, I'm just saying from rural America, typical America, or they could have been from North Chicago for all I know, if they were anti-Semites or acted like it, or were callow, and were callous, and were not very sensitive to other people, if they made comments like that, or literally, were not very nice to people of another religion, or of another whatever, another origin. As I say, Poles particularly were very much despised or looked down upon by other people. And if that happened, it didn't get too far. But it certainly was there, because we only gained the consciousness of not being nasty to other people after the Civil Rights Movement prevailed. Before that, America was not a place that was very friendly to others.
Were you, while you were in the service, were you like open with your German heritage with your other comrades?
I was not. One of my big issues when I came to America was that I had been from the age of about 8 years old, 9 years old, felt that because I was Jewish, I was not a regular human being. Germans called the Jews subhuman, Untermenschen. And the Nazis, and then many Germans following the Nazis. And I was very sensitive to the idea that people might not accept me, or I might not get equal opportunity. My real issue was equal opportunity, much as African Americans had to struggle to get equal opportunity. And I was very sensitive to those kinds of things. And my name, until 1943, was not Walter Reed, it was Werner Rinsberg. And even if I pronounced it the English way, Werner Rinsberg, it was still German and Jewish. And I really chafed under that, because the minute I walked into a room, whether I looked it or not, and they said, oh, what's your name? Werner Rinsberg. Bingo. I was categorized. And I was categorized, in my mind, probably overdid it because of my experiences before, as inferior, as not equal, as not having equal chance. Okay. So when I was advised in March of 1943 by one of my non-coms, non-commissioned officers in Granite City, Illinois, that I would be becoming a citizen next week at the courthouse in East St. Louis, somebody whispered or said, by the way, if you want to change your name, this is a good time to do it. You can do it at the same time. So I immediately seized the opportunity, and I ceased being Werner Rinsberg, and I became Walter Reed. Now, you notice anything funny about that? Same initials. I was very, very self-conscious about changing the name of my family and that my parents had given me. I was only 19 years old, and as you probably know, when you're 19 years old, you're not like when you're 70. And I was very self-conscious about doing that, hesitant in a way, yet wanting to do it. So I decided to keep the same initials. But I wanted a real English-American sounding name. And as a further concession, and I didn't then know yet that my parents were already murdered in Poland by the Nazis, but I sort of felt they might resent, and I wanted to not offend them. So I kept my first name, Werner, as my middle name until right now. My middle name has always been Werner. I'm Walter W. Reed. So yes, I changed the name in order to sound American. And it stood me in good stead, because for many years most people didn't know that I was born in Germany. Most people didn't know anything about my background, and never in my life was I ever refused a job or advancement because of who I supposedly was.
How did you choose Walter Reed?
As I say, I wanted to keep the same initials, and it sounded good, and it's so long ago I don't remember.
Ah, okay. Well, it is a famous name in the United States.
But in those days, the Walter Reed Hospital wasn't nearly as well known as it is now, and for many years on the East Coast, they said, Walter Reed. People would say, Walter Reed, are you connected with the theater chain? And see, you people have never heard of Walter Reed Theaters. It was a very well-known movie house chain on the East Coast and in Florida, the Walter Reed Theaters. And people quite often, if they were from the East, they wouldn't say anything about the hospital. They would ask whether I'm connected with the theater chain. Times change.
What would you say the most dangerous situation you were ever a part of was?
I really was never in the kind of danger that one thinks about when you think of soldiers in battle. That is to say, I was never shooting at Germans with my rifle, although I had one. I was trained to shoot it. I was never quite in battle, in other words, that way. On the other hand, I vividly remember the first time a mortar shell, German mortar shell, fell near me. It's about where you're sitting. And I was just walking into a house right after I was sent to the front. And that thing was smoking. And it came down, and I have not been more scared in my life than when that thing landed. You get used to it. Then the next time, we were in the city of Saarlautern, which is on the western border of Germany. And this was in December 1944. It was the same town where we sang Christmas songs with the German prisoners. And I was driving, we were on one side of the Saar River, which isn't very wide, and the Germans were on the other side, and there was shelling going on constantly. You know, in war, it's not just rifle fire, it's shelling that kills a lot of people and injures a lot of soldiers. And I was driving we had two Jeeps in our interrogator group, and I was driving our lieutenant somewhere in that town in the Jeep, and shells started landing. And I got scared and I panicked. And I wrapped that Jeep very neatly into a tree. That's something I remember because the lieutenant in his steel helmet went right through the windshield and broke his nose and got the Purple Heart. He was angry and he said he'd never let me drive again. But I wasn't crashing the Jeep because I didn't know how to drive. I was scared stiff. And the other time I remember, we were moving on the west side of the Rhine before my division crossed the Rhine. We were in a convoy, which you often were, and we were in a Jeep and other guys were in trucks, and all of a sudden the alarm sounded, and a German dive bomber came. You know, we talked about the kamikaze pilots in Japan, but the Germans in all the World War II times used what they called Stukas. Those were dive bombers. Now, they were not suicide bombers like the Japanese, but the Germans were very skilled and they had planes that could do that. Fighter planes that went down like this and strafed and then went right back up. And several of those came along. You could hear the alarm that were coming. We just literally stopped the car, the Jeep, dove out of there into a ditch. You didn't care whether you got wet, dirty, or what. You just dove. I remember that attack. So, since I remember those very clearly, you get the picture that I was not really fighting or in danger the way usually infantry or tank soldiers are, because that's not the kind of a soldier I was, fortunately, because I was looking to the prospect of being a combat engineer, which would have been a lot worse.
Where were you when the war finally ended?
I have forgotten an awful lot about World War II, but I remember the moment when the war ended very well on May 6, 1940. We were in the convoy driving somewhere in northern Germany. You know, we'd already penetrated and the Americans had joined up with the Russians. And here was Winston Churchill on the radio. We did have a radio somewhere nearby, and I could hear him declare the end of the war. That's where I was. I wasn't doing anything specific. We weren't hugging any girls. We didn't drink champagne. We were on the road. But I remember Winston Churchill pronouncing the end of the war. Obviously, we couldn't hear Roosevelt in Germany, but we could hear Churchill. And that's the moment when that happened.
How long after that day until you returned to the United States?
Well, I had an interesting time after the Armistice, after the defeat of Germany, because I was quickly transferred. The 95th Infantry Division had nothing more to do. I forget what happened to them. But I was transferred, and so were all the other guys in my interrogator unit. There were 7 of us, as I said. And we were reassigned to what was then called Counterintelligence Service, CIC. And the Counterintelligence Service did not interrogate prisoners. We were literally doing the CIA kind of work as soldiers, not as CIA personnel, not secret. But we were attached to the immediately formed military government. And the reason was we were German speakers. So we could do the kind of thing that needed to be done. And what was the job? Germany was defeated, but Germany was permeated by Nazi party members, by people who hated other people. Not just Americans, but all the Europeans they conquered. They were nasty too. And those Nazis were likely to end up in university faculty jobs, in local government as mayors. I'm talking about villages. I'm not talking about the mayor of Berlin. They were likely to end up and insinuate themselves and hide themselves in those areas. My main job, along with others like me, as counterintelligence guys attached to the military government in various localities, our job was to help denazify Germany. So our job became all over Germany in different places, and I didn't just do it in one place, I did it in different places for about 6 months or so. Our job was to find who were the Nazis, not soldiers, but Nazi party members, the dyed-in-the-wool Nazis in local communities, and to prevent them from gaining local government jobs, being mayors. And one of my jobs was to help denazify, as we called it, the University of Marburg in central Germany. Marburg University was, and still is, one of the most famous universities with a medical school. Marburg Medical School is very well known, still is. And here I was in 1945, I was 21 years old. I had never set foot on the college campus at home, ever. Barely, didn't even graduate high school. And here I was helping to decide which German famous university faculty members could continue to teach. That was part of my job. Obviously, I was not very well qualified, but to make all those judgments, I was qualified to figure out who was a Nazi and who wasn't, because we were trained to do that as interrogators, and we had a lot of information about that, and we had all kinds of ways we knew how to do that. And there were an awful lot of Nazi opponents who came out of the woodwork and said, this guy's a bastard, this guy was a Nazi, and this woman, she's the worst. So that kind of, and as German speakers, they could talk to us, and that was our job. So that was the main occupation that I had before I was shipped back to the United States in early 1946.
When did you finally learn about the full scope of what the Holocaust had been?
Today we have a term for all of that, and you just used it, the Holocaust. In those days, that word had not yet been coined, because the depth and the breadth and the horror of the Holocaust was not known. It seeped out gradually. Today we do an awful lot of stuff, and we hear and see a lot of stuff about the American soldiers who discovered the concentration camps. There's a lot of information about that. Believe me, we who were soldiers in Europe didn't know a thing about that. These were just a few people in a few places. And since communication wasn't like it is today, it's not instant, there was no television, there were no cable news or anything, there was no text messaging, therefore it took a long time for information to get around. And it was a long time before I had any awareness, even though I was very conscious and concerned about it, as to what happened to my parents. And we didn't know about gas chambers and mass murder until long after I came back to America. Our news media did not report about it here. And when they did, it was on page 20. Okay, so it was not the kind of thing that's in the consciousness of people today. It took me quite a while to find out what happened to my family. But war was over in May 1946. By July, I was able to borrow a Jeep. I was in northern Germany, and my home area is in southern Germany. I was able to borrow a Jeep and drive down there and go to my home village and ask people. I didn't find my parents, so I asked what happened. And they said, well, all the Jewish people in this village, 26 families in a village with about 1,000 population, and the locals, some of whom I remembered and knew, said, well, they were all sent to the east to a labor camp about 2 years ago. And that is what the Nazis told the German people. That's also what they told the victims. And most of the victims, even though they could guess maybe things would be worse than that, most of the victims really never knew that they were being sent east to Poland to murder camps. They thought they were being sent to labor camps to get them out of Germany. And so the long answer to your very short question, namely, when we find out, took quite a long time. And when I went back to my village to find out about these things, the local people did not know what had happened to these Jewish people. Now I know everything. I've been to the places, but that's a different story.
What was it like the first time you went to one of the concentration camps? What was going on in your mind those days?
The first time we have to make a distinction. People use the word concentration camp as murder camps, and they were not. There's a difference. Concentration camps were intimidation camps, and they were all over Germany. And the Germans not only put Jews into concentration camps, but any enemy of the state, including Catholic priests, including communists, politicians, gay people, etc. So concentration camps were all over Germany. Many people were brutalized, some were murdered there, but it was not mass murder. The gas chambers were all in Poland, in murder camps, extermination camps. And we know an awful lot about everything on that. I never went to a concentration camp, that is, to a detention camp, until about 15 years ago. So for most of my life, I had never been to one. I frankly had no desire to go there, because for me, all those things that happened in those days are in the past. And I have managed psychologically, which is not easy, and most survivors cannot do that, but I've managed psychologically to put the horror and the crimes that were committed to people I know, to people in my family, and to others, into the past, and not to get myself all wrought up over it. Most people can't do that. I did, and that's why I had no cause or no reason to go back and say, I want to see one of those places. But since we started traveling after I retired and been all over the world and over Europe many, many times, we did go to Dachau. And I've been to Mauthausen on a bicycle tour with Americans in Austria. It's a horrible place. And when you see that, you really begin to see it. So I have been there, but it's all in the last 20 years. Before I had no interest, I had no time. And one learns from being there, but I had no need for it.
How did your service change, how you think about other wars and how you lived your day-to-day life?
My service changed me completely because the first thing it did, there was a book out that came out a month ago called The Enemy I Knew. And in that book, many people like me who were refugees from Nazi Germany relate how they became Americans as a result of their being in the army, which they would never have done that fast if they had just been refugees and lived in New York or in Chicago or in St. Louis. For me, it's exactly that way. Once I got out of, when I lived in Brooklyn, New York from fall of 1941 until the spring of 1943, the only people I knew were the people at work and all my refugee family members and their friends who were all refugees. I really didn't know any Americans, and I don't think I was really more than just a refugee. I was not an American, really in the true sense. And being mixed up in the military with all kinds of Americans and traveling, being stationed in different parts of America, made me an entirely different kind of person from what I was before. So I came out of the war definitely not a German refugee. Well, I was, but I really was an American by then. And one other thing happened. I could never have afforded to go to college. I came with nothing. My family members, my relatives, all had to leave everything behind. They didn't have very much. They were typical refugees. So I could not have gone to college if it hadn't been for the so-called GI Bill. The government paid for my tuition. And I went to the University of Missouri and studied journalism. And going there and getting an education totally changed my life. In my case, because I had been undereducated, because I was a refugee all this time, and it also really made me truly an American. And it just altered my life entirely, the direction it took. And there are other people like me who, you notice I don't have an accent. There are most people like me who, I'm 85 years old, most people like me who are 70, 80 years old still speak with that Sherman accent, like Kissinger. But for me, the experience of being in the Army and then getting an education, thanks to the US government, has totally changed me.
Do you have anything else you'd like to share with us before we wrap it up?
I can't think of too much, except maybe one thing. You often get to talk to former soldiers who, when they get old like I am, begin to glory in the fact that they are heroes, and they're American Legion, or whatever they are, or they're Vietnam War veterans, or they're Korean veterans, etc. Not yet the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan. They're mostly suffering. But the older ones only remember the good things, and they're patriots and they're heroes. And what I like to say is that for me, it's not like that. For me, war is horrible. Countries, people that make war, I have not much use for. War is not a good thing. And people who fight in wars are not people that I look up to. We have to defend our country, true. But we shouldn't glorify what that is. It's a horror. And anyone that's ever seen dead people murdered in war, when they really think about it, would share my view. I had the experience about 2 weeks ago of being asked to talk to 50 Cub Scouts at the museum, the Historical Society Museum in Wilmette. And I was supposed to talk to them about heroes. We talked about a lot of heroes, and I asked them who are heroes, and none ever mentioned soldiers. So I thought, because of the heroic kind of thing that we always assign to all soldiers, just because they're serving, and especially after they're killed, we make heroes out of them, and we forget what they're doing. So I asked these kids, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, are soldiers heroes? Oh, yes. I said, what do soldiers do? And not one of them could tell me soldiers kill. And I said, well, you should realize some soldiers are heroes, but soldiers also have the job of killing. And we should remember that that's not a good thing, no matter who's doing it, no matter why they're doing it. And we should at all costs avoid wars and soldiers who are killing. That's an attitude I have that I do not find. I attend Memorial Day observances every year, and I sort of cringe when these old gentlemen, my contemporaries, are up there and they're glorifying war. I think it's the wrong thing. So that's one thing I would add. I'm just as good a soldier